body, and it's an enormous pleasure and privilege for me to be here. I'm extremely grateful to the Institute for the invitation. This is the first of two lectures, and in these two lectures I want to make 5 points. I'll tell you what they are, because everything else is just an elaboration of those points. So here they are. First, the concept of transmission is linked to a genealogical model that separates the acquisition of knowledge as information from its practical enactment, and is not for that reason appropriate to describe the ways in which people ordinarily come to know what they do. First point. Second, learning in practice, even when it involves imitation or copying, is a creative process, but the source of that creativity lies not in innovation, but in improvisation. Same distinction. Thirdly, such practice entails not the matching of forms, but the alignment of movements through the coordination of perception and action. That coordination of perception and action is the essence of skill. Fourthly, then, skilled practice, thus conceived, is an itinerant movement along a way of life, understood as a path to be followed, rather than as a corpus of rules and principles transmitted to ancestors. And then fifthly, this path following is given not in engagement between practitioners and the material world by way of the senses, but in the coupling of substantial flows and sensory awareness in a world of materials. So, the remainder of what I have to say is simply an amplification of these points. And in this lecture, I'm going to concentrate on actually the first 4, and the second lecture will concentrate on the 5th. When we speak of intergenerational learning, it's common to say that knowledge is transmitted from one generation to the next. And in a loose sense, there's nothing wrong with that. But there has been a tendency, and I think particularly in the literature of psychology, to interpret the metaphor of transmission much more literally, as though in the performance of a learned tradition, people convert into bodily behavior, as anthropologist Hans Berber put it once. They convert representations or prototypical schemata that have already been copied into their heads through a prior process of replication. So they first acquire the representations and then they act them out. And the logic applied here is one of what I've called the genealogical model. The defining assumption of this model is that individuals are specified in their essential genetic and cultural constitution, independently and in advance of their life in the world, by way of the bestowal of attributes from ancestors. In biology, this genealogical assumption underwrites the classic distinction between genotype and phenotype. The genotype is supposed to furnish a formal specification of an organism to be, given at the point of conception in the DNA of the genome. The phenotype is the manifest form that arises from that organism's growth and maturation in a particular environment. In psychology, the same logic is played out in the classic distinctions between social and individual learning. Social learning refers to the way in which context-free information is copied from teacher to novice. Social learning then individual learning to novices' repeated attempts to apply already copied information in particular environmental contexts of action. Some anthropologists and psychologists have even taken to calling the elements of transmitted information means that are said to inhabit the mind and control the carrier's thought and behaviour, just as genes inhabit the body and control its ontogenetic development. though popularized in recent decades by Richard Dawkins and his acolytes, this idea has in fact been present in the literature for a century or more, and its longevity, its persistence, is matched only by its proponents' insistence that it stands at the cutting edge of science. Continually saying this is a new idea, it's actually been around for an awfully long time. A moment ago I quoted the words of Dan Spearpair, who has been one of the leading advocates of the transmission model of cultural learning. So let me present you with one of his favourite examples. In Frenchman, it concerns the preparation of Mornay's sauce. Now, the recipe for preparing this sauce has been handed down from generation to generation as part of a culinary tradition. It comprises a series of instructions that in the past would have been enunciated orally, but are nowadays written down in a book. Any novice, given the capacity to read, can acquire these instructions. Or more precisely, what exists on paper as a set of ink patterns can be translated into a corresponding set of verbal commands in the reader's memory. But no actual cookery is involved here, because cooking, in Spearpair's account, has to do not with the replication of knowledge or with its copying across generations, but with its behavioural enactment. To cook, according to Spearpair, the received instructions have to be converted into actual bodily behaviour. So first get your instructions from the recipe book, decoding the ink patterns on the page, and then you get on with the cookery. And that sounds simple enough, but there's a catch, which can be highlighted by means of another of Spearpair's favourite examples. Like the recipe for Mornay's sauce, the story of Little Red Riding Hood is also part of a long tradition. Generations of children have heard it told, and as adults have told it to their own children. And each such telling, according to Spearpair, is a bodily performance based on a remembered script. But if that is so, then by the same token, one would convert the recipe for Mornay's sauce into behaviour just by reciting the words from the recipe book. Spearpair's claim, however, is that it is by preparing the sauce that already copied instructions are converted into behaviour, and this makes about as much sense as supposing that the child converts the story of Little Red Riding Hood into behaviour by setting off to her grandmother's with a pot of butter and a cake. There is indeed a parallel between storytelling and cooking, not because both entail the enactment of a pre-copied script, but because in both cases the enactment is itself a process of copying in which information is not so much passively handed down as actively regenerated. So, how do novices actually learn to cook rather than to reproduce recipes? They do so, of course, by working alongside already skilled practitioners in the kitchen. Though I've never had the proverbial opportunity to teach my mother to suck eggs, I did have the opportunity many years ago to teach my then small daughter how to break eggs in the course of learning how to make an omelette. This operation requires no small amount of skill. Keeping a firm hold of the egg, you have to strike it against the edge of a cup or mixing bowl so as to achieve a clean crack of sufficient extent to enable you subsequently to split the shell easily into two halves, releasing the contents into the bowl. If the force of the strike is too light, the shell will not crack, or the crack will be so short that when you try to split open the shell, you have to apply so much pressure that the whole shell is crushed into pieces, leaving shards of shell in the bowl and your fingers all covered in egg. If the force is too great, the entire egg splits on impact, and most of the contents end up all over the work surface of the kitchen rather than the bowl. And what makes the task especially difficult is that the force required is not constant. It varies from egg to egg, depending on the thickness of the shell. The problem for the novice is this. How do you know how thick the shell is when you cannot see until the egg is broken? Now there's a trick to this that you won't find in any recipe book, but which experienced cooks use so routinely that they scarcely are aware of it. First, tap the egg lightly against the edge of the bone. Listen for the sound. This will tell you how hard to strike next time so as to achieve a clean crack. Thin shells and thick shells sound differently when they are tapped. So this is how I teach my daughter to break eggs. She holds the egg in her downturned hand. I hold her hand in mine, also downturned, and together we strike the egg against the bowl, first lightly and tentatively, and then firmly and with controlled force. And in that way my daughter gets the feel of it for herself and the sound of it too. And she is also looking at what she is doing. So through repeated trials she becomes progressively better able to adjust her striking force to a multi-sensory monitoring of the task as it unfolds, seamlessly combining vision, hearing and touch. So, having learned to break eggs, let me now return to the recipe for Mornay sauce. When the recipe tells me to melt the butter in a small pan and stir in the flour, I'm able to follow it only because it speaks to my experience of melting and stirring, of handling such substances as flour and butter, and of finding the relevant ingredients and utensils from the various corners of my kitchen. The verbal commands of the recipe, in other words, draw their meaning not from their attachment to mental representations inside my head, but from their positioning within the familiar context of my activity in the home. Like signposts in a landscape, they provide specific directions to practitioners as they make their way through a field of related practices. Each command is strategically located at the point at which the original author of the recipe, looking back on previous experiences preparing the dish in question, considered to be a critical juncture in the total process. Between these points, however, the cook is expected to be able to find his or her own way around, attentively and responsively, but without further recourse to explicit rules of procedure, or in a word, skillfully. So the information in the book is not in itself knowledge. It rather opens up a path to knowledge, thanks to its location within a field of practices that is already partially familiar by virtue of previous experience. So only when placed in the context of skills gained through prior experience does information specify a route that is comprehensible and can practically be followed. And only a route so specified can lead to knowledge. And it's in this sense that I believe all knowledge is founded on skill, and not the other way around. Just as my knowledge of the landscape is gained by walking through it, following various signposted routes, so my knowledge of cookery comes from following the several recipes of the book. This is not knowledge that has been transmitted to me. It is knowledge that has grown in me as I have followed the same paths as my predecessors and under their direction. So recipes in this sense are just like stories. They have a narrative structure. First do this, then that. Observe as you do this and that, how the consistency of your ingredients changes. Now, of course, anthropologists have long recognized the educative function of storytelling all over the world. But they have been wrong to treat stories as vehicles for the intergenerational transmission of encoded messages which, once deciphered, would reveal an all-embracing system of mental representation. The stories do not, as a rule, come with their meanings already attached, nor do they mean the same for different people. What they mean is something that listeners discover for themselves by placing them in the context of their own lives. Indeed, it might not be until long after a story is told that its meaning is revealed, when you find yourself retracing the very same path that the story relates. Then, and only then, does the story offer guidance on how to proceed. So evidently, in cookery, as much as in any other field of practical activity, people don't acquire their knowledge ready-made, but grow into it through a process that might best be described as guided rediscovery. And as I've already suggested, the process is akin to that of following trails through a landscape. Each story will take you so far until you come across another one that will take you further. Now, I refer to this trail following as wayfaring, and my thesis in a nutshell is that it is through wayfaring and not transmission that knowledge is carried on. It's useful to say of the people of a culture that they follow a way of life. And more often than not, this is taken to mean a prescribed code of conduct, sanctioned by tradition, that individuals are bound to follow in their day-to-day behaviour. The task of the wayfarer, however, is not to act out a script received from predecessors, but literally to negotiate a path through the world. Thus, the way of life is a path to be followed, along which one can keep on going, rather than coming to a dead end or getting stuck in a loop of ever-repeating cycle. Indeed, keeping on going might involve a good measure of creative improvisation. It's in following this path, that is, in their movement along a way of life, that people grow into knowledge. And I now want to specify more precisely the sense in which the movement of learning in practice is creative. There's a tendency in much writing, thinking, or creativity to locate its sources in images and objects rather than in actual performance. And that's why creation is so often equated with innovation. This equation of creation and innovation rests on what I call a backwards reading, according to which the creativity of action is judged by the novelty of its outcomes, by comparison with what has gone before, and traced to its antecedent conditions in the form of unprecedented ideas in the minds of individual agents. So you start with something, a bottle like this has never been seen before, and we suppose then that it must be the result of an idea that came into the mind of a bottle maker who has then produced this novel bottle, and that's where the creativity is. You read back from the bottle to the idea. And this backwards reading is equivalent to what the anthropologist Alfred Gell, writing about the work of art, has called the abduction of agency. Creativity is accordingly opposed to imitation, which is simply running off replicas from an already established design. Running off a whole lot of bottles of exactly this kind. And precisely such a view underpins theories of observational learning of the kind I described a moment ago, which posit that knowledge is acquired through a process of transmission. Because with that model, creative innovation can only come about through the mutation and recombination of elements of transmitted design. Hence, of course, the analogy with genetic association. And yet this omits, leaves out, the creativity of the very process wherein every design is practically enacted. And to recover this generative dynamic that actually gives rise to things, creativity has to be read forward, that is, in the movements that give rise to things, rather than backwards from their outcomes. And to read creativity forward is to focus not on abduction, on working back from the object to an image, but to focus on improvisation, moving forward. To improvise is to follow the ways of the world as they unfold, rather than to recover a chain of connections from an end point to a starting point on a route already travelled. And the aim is not to reach a terminus, but to keep on going. But in keeping on going, one can travel the same ground over and over again. And in any skilled craft, the development of proficiency calls for repetitive practice, in which novices are required to copy or imitate exemplars that are shown to them, so incorporating into their own bodily dispositions the sensibilities of the masters in whose paths they follow, while simultaneously developing personal styles of their own. For example, in the Chinese art of calligraphy, novices begin by tracing the shadows of the model to be copied, which is placed directly below the translucent paper on which they write. So there might be a master copy of the calligraphy here. They put the translucent paper on top, the figure shines through, and they copy through there. In the next stage, paper and model are placed side by side on paper, rather than on top, side by side, forcing novices to improvise the necessary gestures for themselves, rather than being guided by the shadows of the masters. Then, in the final stages of learning, novices are encouraged to shake themselves loose from the master's clutching hands. And in this stage, as referring to Yuping's Yen's fine study of the power of calligraphy in contemporary Chinese society, at this stage, all the learned rules are banished into oblivion, and the heart becomes the only guide of the hand. Now, at no point in this three-stage process of inskillment do practitioners cease to copy. Every performance of a calligraphic work is a going over, insofar as it is modelled on previous studies, and yet every going over is itself an original movement which carries the work on, even as it follows paths already traced. And for this reason, in calligraphy, no work is ever finished. There's no such thing as the finished work. You don't look at a finished piece of calligraphy and understand its meaning. You can only understand calligraphy by getting into it and, in a sense, performing it yourself, even if it's only in your mind. So, such a work is present, becoming rather than creating, finished. If it cannot be contained within the bounds of a project that originates with a conception in the mind of an agent and ends with its realization in the material. Don't start with an idea here and end with its realization there. It rather carries on throughout its performances, none of which is the work, but all of which contribute to its never-ending generation. And in this regard, calligraphy has much in common with the performance of instrumental music. As a practicing cellist, I've played the same movements from Bach's set of suites for unaccompanied cello again and again, to perhaps the despair of my wife and family. And I shall have a cello here very kindly provided by the faculty. I will sit up and get it out and there it is. That's just the beginning thing. And I could do that calligraphically like this. Like that. It's just the same. One can trace it out. That same movement. It's a movement that is not a kind of prepared thing. It's a movement that exists in my body, and I can just. And so on and so forth. And I won't embarrass you by playing that further. But the point is that there's a movement there that is, in a sense, in my body, but it's in my body as a movement. So, this is not, when I sit down to play like this, it's not like running off identical copies from a template, whether it's engraved in memory or on the score. It's not as though I got a template for that and I'm just running it off, which will be equivalent to, say, putting a CD on a machine. Then exactly the same sound comes out each time. But when I play, I'm carrying on with the music rather than repeating it. Or another way of putting it is to say that it is not an iteration, but an itineration. It's an itinerary, following a movement. I'm not simply repeating it. Because in my consciousness and in my experience, the music lives on as an ever-flowing current. Each time I begin to play, I'm launched once more into the current, through which I have to feel my way, rather as a boatman feels the stream, with no assurance of how things are going to turn out. And it is, at every moment, a risky endeavour. Though one might recover from errors, it's impossible to go back and correct them. So I am, when I play, an itinerant, a wayfarer, and, like all wayfarers, I have to improvise. Nor is my performance any less improvisatory than it is score. There is actually a score for that music, although in fact the score itself is a record of a somewhat improvisatory, it always was an improvisatory piece. But to the contrary, the more strictly a performance is specified, the greater the improvisational demands placed on practitioners to get it right. So any formal resemblance between the copy and the model isn't given in advance, but is rather a horizon of attainment to be judged in retrospect. So one can, with music, go on and on and on playing the same piece and try and reach perfection, but you'll never get there. It's like moving up to an asymptote. And people who work with calligraphy say the same thing. They have masterworks that they try to copy. They'll never get it exactly as good. You'll never be able to play Mozart and every other do calligraphy just perfectly, but you can keep on trying. And that's why there's creativity, even and especially, in the maintenance of an established tradition. The music psychologist Nicholas Cook has shown that a classical musician who plays from a score improvises just as much as a jazz musician who does not. The difference lies in their aims. The former, the classical musician, is as it were centripetal, aiming for the bullseye. The jazz musician is centrifugal, seeking to cast one. And this same variation from centripetal to centrifugal can be discerned in many other fields of performance, such as in calligraphy, in dance, and in athletics. To see this, in the case of athletics, you only have to compare different sports such as archery and shot put. In archery, you have to try and hit the target. In shot put, the point is to get the shot to go as far as possible from your body. Now, in athletics and the performing arts, as indeed in any craft, novices have to learn through repetitive practice in copying models shown to them. But to copy is not to replicate a pre-existing form, but to align observation of the model with action in a world that is itself suspended in movement. So fluent performance has a rhythmic quality. This quality does not lie in the repetitiveness of the movement itself, because for there to be rhythm in movement, the movement must be felt. The practitioner who has a feel for what he or she is doing is one who can bring the many concurrent movements with which he must engage more or less interface with one another. And this calls for continual correction in response to an ongoing perceptual monitoring of the task as it unfolds. Rhythmicity, as the philosopher Henri Lefebvre has argued, implies not just repetition, but differences within repetition. Perhaps another analogy actually is with juggling. where you're juggling balls, and actually every time the trajectory of the balls is a little bit different, but you're repeating the same motion, but it's rhythmic because you're all the time adjusting your hands in order to actually keep the amplitude of the trajectory of the balls constant. So feeling lies in the coordination of movement and perception that, I think, is of the essence of skilled practice. And by way of perception, the practitioner's own rhythmic gestures are attuned to the multiple rhythms of the environment. So any task which is itself a movement takes place within what André de Rodrigues, the great French anthropologist of techniques, called a network of movements, within which the existence of every practitioner is suspended. I believe actually that it's more appropriate to speak of a meshwork than a network. That is a meshwork of contrapuntal lines rather than a network of connecting points. But I'll return to that later on, I think in the next lecture. For now, the conclusion I want to stress is that the measure of skill lies in the sensibility that enables practitioners to respond to environmental perturbations that would throw the performance off course were it confined to the execution of a fixed motor program. As anthropologist Charles Varela has pointed out, skilled performance aims for a precision which should not be confused with the accuracy of pre-planned and measured execution. There's a distinction here between precision and accuracy. The novice, sticking rigidly to rules, is inclined to go astray. The expert recovers poise by bending. So the skilled practitioner is not accurate, but precise. Anthropologist Craig Downey offers a good illustration of this point, drawn from his experience of learning the Afro-Brazilian dance and martial art known as capoeira Angola. The particular movement on which he focuses, the headstand, bananeira de capek, may seem extreme and even foolhardy to those of us unaccustomed to thinking of the head and neck as a fifth limb. But actually, to people who are used to carrying loads on the head, sometimes heavy loads, even equal to or even exceeding the weight of the body, the headstand entails nothing more than an inversion in which the head on the ground carries the weight of the body, rather than the body on the ground carrying an equivalent weight on the head. So whether learning to carry loads on the head or to stand on it, the key point for Downey is that learning is itself a developmental process. It's the way a human organism undergoes growth and transformation, physiologically, neurologically, and psychologically, in and through the movements it carries on, and the postures that it endures. Now, the demands placed on the developing body in the course of learning moves in capoeira, such as the headstand, might seem to us extreme, though as Stanley remarks, no more extreme than learning to spend the best part of every day in a sitting position, as we academics is custom to do. The principle is the same, regardless of the particular activities in question. Living bodies are never made, but always in the making. And a specific expertise is not added on in the form of a motor schema, internalized into a body already primed with the capacities to receive it, but is itself a developmental outcome of what Stanley calls kinetic self-exploration. In this exploration, although guided by others, novices have perforce to find their own way. And if it turns out that specific skills are common to a community of practice, this is not because the operations of practitioners' bodies are directed from within by the same motor schema transmitted to them at the start, but because these developmental explorations have converged upon the same or similar outcomes. Incidentally, work by Esther Helen and her colleagues on how infants learn to walk arrives at pretty much the same conclusion. It's not as though we all start off with a genetic set of genetic instructions for walking, and that's why we all walk. It's rather that every infant comes into the world and tries to, and it has the predicament of trying to get around the place, and they improvise, they experiment, and they end up hitting on the same solution, which is to go around on two legs. Dance anthropologist Brenda Farnell has directly confronted the question of how we are to understand the creativity of apparently imitative and consistently repeated movements in the work of contemporary dance artists. The precision and coordination of these movements call for a finely tuned kinesthetic awareness, along with an awareness of on the part of each dancer of their own internal bodily sensations, the exercise of both focal and peripheral vision, a sensitivity to the rhythms and sounds of breathing and footwork, and an ability to feel each other's presence in a shared intersubjective space. And the development of these perceptual skills requires years of practice. And of course, this practice develops the dancer's muscles and their athletic prowess. But muscle power and athleticism take second place as goals of training to the development of movement perception. What develops, according to Farnell's collaborator, choreographer Robert Wood, is a whole body intelligence, an intelligence in motion, capable of responding to an ever-changing environment. This intelligence, says Wood, allows the dancer to let go, or simply to be. But the problem is, how can such letting go be reconciled with a daily training regime in which prescribed movements are repeated over and over again? You'd think that such a regime would have the opposite effect of habituating movement, of dulling the senses, and of sending conscious awareness into retreat, that you just get into the habit of things. I think the answer to this question hinges on the meaning of this much used and abused term, embodiment. The philosopher of dance, Maxine Sheets Johnston, protests against the facile appeal to this concept, so pervasive in current writing in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, as if merely by placing the word embodied before practice, the still festering wound created by a surgical separation of the organ of self-knowledge from the flesh and blood of human beings could be magically healed. Just put embodied in front of practice, and the spectre of Descartes will go away. Employed in this sense, Sheets Johnston argues, the notion of embodiment is nothing more than a lexical band-aid which allows the divide between knowing and being to persist simply by covering it up. And it will continue to do so for as long as we fail to recognize that the key to both self-knowledge and organic life is movement. It's not just that as living organisms we move. We are our movements. Therefore, the knowledge we have of ourselves is inseparable from the sense we have of our movements, or in a word, from kinesthesia, from our own experience of movement. As animate beings, Sheets Johnston insists, we don't experience ourselves and one another in the first place as packaged, but as both moving and moved, in an ongoing response, or what I would call correspondence, co-respondence, to those around us. We are mutually responding to one another. And this is as true of the movements of everyday life as it is of the more specialized refinements of these movements in dance, which I think is why dance, treated not as an object but as a means of investigation, can cast such a bright light on what it means not just to live in the world, but to be alive to it. Actually, however, Sheets Johnston's protest is more against a particular use of the concept of embodiment, albeit one that is so pervasive as to be almost universal than against the concept of embodiment in itself. Because when Farnell, for example, describes human beings as primarily embodied meaning makers, she quite explicitly does not intend to convey the idea of the body as a package within which practices are, so to speak, wrapped up, nor to invoke another widespread image. Is the body to be understood as a sink into which practices settle like sediments in a ditch? Although it's surprising how often we come across metaphors of sedimentation in bodies. But the body in Farnell's usage is neither an object of performance nor an instrument of performance, but rather a dynamic centre of unfolding activity. Whether in dancing, gesturing, talking or writing, performance, she insists, issues from the body. It is not about the body. And that takes us back to the question of how to reconcile the repetitiveness of training with the heightened sensitivity that it is supposed to engender. How is it that by repeating the same things over and over again, far from just becoming dull and habituating, we become more alive and more sensitive? The aim of such training, we've seen, is not primarily ergonomic. It's not about creating bodies that are more energetic and efficient in their movements. It is rather about the education of perception. We've already seen through the example of capoeira that learning cannot be properly understood as the internalization of a motor scheme. It's not some scheme that's been transmitted to the body. It's not therefore imitative if by imitation we mean the replication within the minds of novices of schemata originally housed within the minds of experts and expressed in bodily execution. But it is about copying, about aligning one's own ongoing movements with those of one's surroundings. Improvising a path through a field of practices, rather than mechanically executing the rules and representations of transmitted culture. The skilled practitioner does not impose pre-existent forms on inert matter, but intervenes in the fields of forces and currents of material wherein forms are generated. And in this sense, as I've shown, practitioners are wayfarers or itinerants. Their skill then lies in their ability to find the grain of the world becoming and to follow it while bending it to their evolving purpose. And in the next lecture, tomorrow, I'll explore the implications of that conclusion for understanding, making and doing. But that's as far as I'm going to take it for today. Thank you very much.